Hello everyone, and welcome to Final Fantasy Occasionally. I'm Drew Kreisman, and on this episode, I'm going to be talking a bit about Final Fantasy XVI and the 2023 Game Awards, or actually much more broadly, the legacy of Final Fantasy and how it relates to the history of video games, because we've already done our conversations on Final Fantasy XVI, not to say that there isn't plenty more to discuss about that game, but anyone looking for our full review can find it here on the Patreon page or on the YouTube channel. I also listed there on the YouTube channel what I believed to be the 10 weakest critiques of Final Fantasy XVI, right? And a lot of the conversation about 16 not getting nominated for Game of the Year ultimately stems from those initial reviews, because those are the same people who end up voting on the awards. And of course, it's always important to keep in context that the Game Awards is just one award ceremony. All the publications do their own. There are things like BAFTA. There's lots of different awards, right? And gamers tend to focus in on this one a lot. It has, and in my view, for good reason, gotten a lot of attention over the years. But I really wanted to pull back more broadly and have this conversation because I recognize that my reaction wasn't even necessarily what I thought it was going to be when the news came out, and seeing a myriad of them out there, I wanted to share a few thoughts. In trying to understand my own internal reaction of not really feeling much of anything, by the way, which was what happened, I ended up writing this on Twitter last night, and I wanted to read it and kind of discuss and explain my thought process along the way. The first thing I said was, I've long since come to accept that Final Fantasy will forever exist in an odd and unique place in gaming. It will never be Mario or Zelda. It will always be on the Mount Rushmore of gaming, but it seeks to do something fundamentally different from most games, and so is tough to compare. Right, I've talked about this before, either on the Final Fantasy Weekly show or a little bit in the Discord, and I'm trying to be better and better about not putting these things at odds. But when I take a look at the grand history of video games, right, there are these three franchises that separate themselves as basically having been there from the beginning of the 8-bit era. I know video games existed before the NES, but again, anyone who knows their history knows that was basically like an MCU reboot, right? It was a renaissance. It's fair to start the clock there a little bit. And since then, these three franchises have, every generation, had big successes, been, you look at the numbers, they're the ones who sell the most Pokemons in a class of its own, but beyond that, these are the three franchises that stand out. And oftentimes, I have felt over the years, as somebody who prefers Final Fantasy, that it's the redheaded stepchild of these, by the way, right? It's in a clear fourth place or third place, depending on whether or not you're counting Pokemon. And what I saw yesterday from a lot of people that follow us and a lot of, influential Final Fantasy people that I see that were really disappointed was, I think, a similar outpouring of, in a year where a Mario game and a Zelda game are back in the nominations for Game of the Year, and it was almost a foregone conclusion, and I am not saying that those games don't deserve their praise. This has been a conversation for 30 years, man. This goes back to Ocarina of Time. I'm not saying that game didn't deserve the praise that it got, right? But when you put it right there next to Final Fantasy VII and the way the top 100 games of all time lists were coming out in the early 2000s, and overwhelmingly the consensus was Mario and Zelda, with Final Fantasy games back there in the 10 to 20 range, right? Now, as we've often discussed, first of all, those ultimately come down, all those reflect are the opinions of whoever happened to take whatever poll at any given time. But I think that general consensus is where a lot of people have started to feel a bit frustrated as Final Fantasy fans, and where I've almost divorced myself from it. Not to make this all about me or us, right? But the reason the Final Fantasy Weekly podcast came into existence in the first place was essentially out of this recognition that it's actually true that Final Fantasy as a video game, judged by the standards of the industry, is not better than Mario or Zelda. those games achieve absolute peak interactivity, which is really the key word. And there's a similar thing that's happened now over the last several years with games like Elden Ring, right? When you look at the way the industry has gone, whether it's, hyping up the big open world stuff, or again, that word interactivity, a number of different ways to play it. Look at the way these games are praised, right? And again, I'm not saying that this is unfair. It makes sense that the video game industry and people who work in the industry and people who write about the industry, who are oftentimes people who were maybe developers themselves or would like to be, who think a lot about game design, level design, combat, all the intricate systems that make up the game part of it. And Mario and Zelda always put gameplay first and foremost, and they do an extraordinary job. But not only them. If you were to take a kind of look, there's no consensus top 10 video game franchises of all time, but again, if you were to take a survey, and whatever you would think might be in there, anything from Halos and Mass Effects and Call of Duties to, if you count like all of the Elden Ring and FromSoft things as one franchise, whatever would be in there, right? 90+% of them are going to be franchises that do prioritize gameplay. And Final Fantasy has always prioritized story and characters. And that, just from the get-go, puts it at odds with the way most games are reviewed. Now, of course, Final Fantasy is not the only video game franchise that does this. There are lots of story-driven games out. Now, I would argue that even a lot of games like, for example, God of War, that we would call story-driven, are still very much putting gameplay first and foremost when it comes to how they're designed. And I thought it was very clear, specifically with Final Fantasy XVI, but with all of them, that gameplay comes secondary. And there are, frankly, just people in the industry who do not accept that, will never accept that, and because of that, they're always going to have some issues with these games. And again, it's consistent. They're being logically consistent. That's why we on this show just decided we're going to take a different perspective. That's why when we review these games, we don't review them on gameplay, audio, sound quality, replayability, side quests, things like that. We talk about their themes. We talk about their politics. We talk about their philosophies. We talk about how well they handle characters of color or characters on the LGBTQ plus spectrum or whatever it may be, right? That all of those things matter more to what makes a Final Fantasy than the gameplay. And so, as I said in the second tweet, in an industry where we evaluate things based on how good they are as video games, interactivity and gameplay are king. It's always caused problems for the franchise that puts story and characters first. We've seen more and more conversation about, quote, interactive movies, right? That these games that are more like movies. And I read recently a Twitter tirade from a managing editor at IGN that, in my mind, was very much just saying the quiet part out loud, where she went through, after GQ had published their top 100 video games list and had quite a few story games rated highly, and they just basically went on and said video games should absolutely be about video games first. Story should be a second or third or fourth thought, and that it's frustrating that video games are losing themselves and trying to be like television or trying to be like movies rather than trying to be like video games. And I've often said that I find this to be incredibly strange. Storytelling is one of the most fundamental human things that we have. Storytelling is a part of every medium. You can no more separate storytelling from an interactive medium, in my mind, than you can any other. From songwriting, from television, from film, from novels. You can't say, well, we should only judge novels based on how good the words in them are and not how well they tell a story. Right? For me, this is the fundamentally counterintuitive thing that I think happens a lot of times inside the industry, which is, for me, video games often contain some of the most impactful stories because they're interactive, but it's still the ones that put story first and foremost and use that interactivity to enhance the story rather than the other way around, which is what games like Zelda, now that they've got more story in them and stuff, do, right? They're still using the story to enhance the gameplay, which is seen as the objectively correct way to do it in the industry. Go and read some of the reviews of Final Fantasy 16, you'll see this exact thing where, especially when it comes to the side quests, you're not supposed to do it that way. They're not supposed to enhance the story. The story is supposed to serve the exploration and the loot grinding. You should design your game in such a way that it does all of this extra stuff that makes it hyper interactive, rather than being a focused and linear experience, which is what Final Fantasy 16 was, right? So that's why, despite all the sales and despite the fact that it is so widely celebrated in many ways, when you look at any individual year, you will see that Final Fantasy games rarely, if ever, win their Game of the Year award. Even back in 1997, GameSpot, which was the biggest, it was essentially the closest we had to the Game Awards now. It was by far the biggest publication out there, especially on the internet, if you're not counting Electronic Gaming Monthly and things like that. And they gave their Game of the Year to Total Annihilation in 1997. Right? It's kind of always been the case that there's been something else that you could say was better. You go and look at all the top 100 lists that have ever been made from the very beginning of people making top 100 video games of all time lists, and you're not going to find one that has a Final Fantasy game on top. And I do think, and again, I'm not saying that that's unfair. What I'm saying is I think that comes down to the people making the lists end up going with the games that are gamier, right? What I'm trying to do here is explain this distinction. Then there's the second part of it, which we've talked a lot about, and I don't want to do too much here because I think everyone listening to this understands it, but it's a huge part of this, right, is the evolution and change. So on top of the fact that you have these games that a lot of times, again, they're not the only ones that do this, but when you're comparing them to the other, quote, great elite video game franchises, they are the ones that put story in front of gameplay more than the rest of them. And then you have the change and evolution part. The fact that over 30 plus years now, Final Fantasy has continued to change things up to such an extent that there's such a wide variety of expectations that it's impossible to meet all of them. You can't have the job system and the materia system and the sphere grid and the gambit system, especially if you're trying to do something totally new, right? All of those things are things of the past. Sometimes they bring back the job systems in certain ways. There are some of them that you can combine, but you can't have all of them all of the time. No Final Fantasy game, none of them has all of the staples. There are several Final Fantasy games that don't have crystals. We've talked about all this stuff, SID, so on and so forth. And so it's this, I think, for me is kind of the essential difficulty because, again, there's no one to blame. There's no one at fault. There's no bad guy here. It's that Final Fantasy has, by being innovative and by constantly changing things up, created a kind of impossible soup for themselves to swim in, where the expectations, it's not just that the expectations are so high in terms of them being good, because I can hear people saying expectations are super high for Mario and Zelda games. Correct. But there's just fewer, if you just literally think of a checklist of things that those games need to have. Like a Mario game doesn't have to have a super deep story. In fact, it's pretty much accepted that it's not going to, right? It doesn't have to have themes. It doesn't have to challenge the way you think about life. It doesn't have to have deep character arcs. It doesn't have to have great writing. It doesn't have to do any of that stuff, right? We just accept that a Final Fantasy game has to do all of those things, but it doesn't just have to do all of those things. It has to do all of those things in a specific way. A Final Fantasy game can be criticized for not having playable female characters. Fairly. A Final Fantasy game can be criticized for not having party mechanics or not having status ailments. There are lots of games that don't have any of those things. But Final Fantasy has such a long history of so many things in it that people have enjoyed that they want those things back. And for a series that's always moving forward, there's always going to be that disappointment. And that's why you have this situation where every game is beloved more outside of its own time. Right, we've talked about how almost every Final Fantasy game ends up finding its audience, and 16, I think, is doing it at a faster rate, honestly, than 13 or 15 did, or 12, which has had really the most extreme renaissance in so many ways that I find more people now who believe that 12 is among the very best that the series ever did, when at the time it came out, it was just as controversial, if not more so, than any of these. It was a massive departure. Like 11, we understood that online is different. Online is online. It was kind of an experimental thing. Some people liked it, some people didn't. But when they're like, okay, they're going back to single player, a lot of us assumed, myself very much included, a return to the kind of traditional turn or active time-based combat we got before. And no, they just kept growing and evolving and changing in a bunch of different directions, and people had to decide whether or not they liked it or didn't. And some people haven't and some people have, but that's kind of what I was trying to explain, I guess, with the tweet. So let me go back to the last couple of things in that tweet thread that I wrote, because this is what I really wanted to break down a little bit more. I wrote, "This is why a Final Fantasy game can make you cry, change your life, contain the music that you might play at your wedding or funeral, but also be considered by the video game industry people to be mid or disappointing. Because how do you compare something that touches your soul to some fun hours being wasted, right? Just some time that was fun." I wrote, "Final Fantasy 16 was a special experience for me, as meaningful as any game I've ever played, and it's hard to weigh that against the industry standards for a genre I don't typically play. But that's not what's important. What matters are the memories we make together." And those last two things that I said there, I wanted to jump into a little bit, because I think this is part of the big disconnect, right? When I've been reading some of these reviews or hanging out in spaces, listening to people talk about these games, or this particular game, Final Fantasy 16, there's a lot of action game fans who felt that in so many ways Final Fantasy 16 failed as an action game. And there are a lot of RPG fans who feel like in so many ways Final Fantasy 16 failed as an RPG. And there are certain levels on which I listen to these people make their cases, and I think, yeah, that you make perfect sense there. Even the stuff that I disagree with, it's a logical argument, right? Whether we're talking about anything from pacing, which is highly subjective, to side quests, to the difficulty level. Status ailments and party team-up attacks are things I would like to have seen. I've discussed before why I don't think those are considered flaws. Just because something could have been in the game to make it better doesn't mean what we got was bad. I do find it strange that even a lot of the people that I heard talk about this still admit that the combat was a lot of fun, which seems to me like it ought to really be the be-all, end-all of our conversation on combat. Was it fun to play? The boss battles were absolutely incredible. We just recently did our top 10 battle systems on YouTube, and I placed it 10th on my list, right? Final Fantasy 16. But I understand that for some people it just didn't meet their expectations of either the action game genre or the RPG genre. And I can hear all of those things out and understand why a person might say, for me, this is an 8 out of 10, or it's a 7 out of 10. I can understand that, while at the same time, not prioritize deep action game mechanics as understood by industry insiders over a story and characters that I'll be thinking about for the rest of my life. Right? And that kind of goes back to my first point, is that it's difficult to compare Final Fantasy to the other things, because you're allowed to be a great video game without a great story. But you're not allowed to be a great Final Fantasy without a great story. You're allowed to be a phenomenal story without having great gameplay, but you can't win Game of the Year or get nominated for Game of the Year if that's how people think about it. But then when you go and read the actual reviews for Final Fantasy 16, you see where the issues arise. And it does all come back to this central point, right? And that, again, Final Fantasy is made for themselves. If you're going to prioritize storytelling and all of the more ambiguous things, because there's a lot more subjectivity when it comes to criticizing a story and characters and themes and plots and all of that, than there are to telling us whether or not a series of video game mechanics work well and are satisfying to interact with. Right? It's not that one's better or worse than the other, it's just that one contains a lot more ambiguity. And so, if you go to OpenCritic and you take a look at the two big negative reviews for Final Fantasy XVI that are pulling down its rating, and probably the thing that stopped it from getting nominated for Game of the Year. The first one comes from Eurogamer. It's something I've talked before. It's one of the most absurd sentences I've ever read in my life. I'm going to read it again. A smart combat system, so they already don't have the problems that I think are the most legitimate that I've talked about with other people in the spaces. A smart combat system straining under the weight of characterful but ponderous pseudo-medieval soap opera with some of the grandest bosses and dullest side quests in Final Fantasy history. That comes from Eurogamer. And Metro Game Central, both of whom gave it a 6 out of 10 essentially, right? An excellent battle system, so again, no problems where you probably could have had the most legitimate ones, shackled to a dispiritingly dull and long-winded fantasy adventure that takes an inordinate amount of time to say nothing of value. In other words, both Eurogamer and Metro Game Central, the deciding factors here, that's all it really takes to knock your thing down below a 90, because the vast majority of other reviews are 9s and ups. 9s and up. These are 100% subjective criticisms. That final bit of the Game Central, it takes an inordinate amount of time to say nothing of value. I could dive into the problematicness of saying that a story who has some central themes about the horrors of slavery and the mistreatment of peoples, saying that it has nothing to say of value. But beyond that, whether you want to dive into, debating that claim, that's 100% subjective. And back to the other point, this is where a Mario game or a Zelda game is never going to be criticized for having nothing to say of value. It's not going to be a 6 out of 10 because Mario has nothing to say of value. We don't expect Mario to have anything to say of value. Final Fantasy games have to. But they can't just have something to say of value. They have to have something to say that's of value in the minds of everybody reviewing it, and they still have to be great video games. They can't fall down on the other part, where some people who gave it more like 8 out of 5s or 8 out of 10s, 8.5 out of 10s, did have a little bit of issues with the combat, right? So when you see like some people saying the combat's absolutely phenomenal, but I hated the story, and other people saying, well, I loved the story, but I hated the combat, it shows you the difficulty of it, right? That this is the impossible soup that I've been talking about that Final Fantasy swims in. You just can't make all of these different people with all of these different perspectives happy. And so it's frustrating to see Mario and Zelda up there again, while this franchise that, again, very much does belong on the Mount Rushmore of gaming, doesn't get nominated. I do think strong year for gaming, and I'm not going to argue against anything that did get nominated. I've never been a Resident Evil fan, but again, that's personal preference. That's just, I don't enjoy that type of game. But that in of itself is I think part of that frustration, where it seems like a lot of the video game industry has decided they just don't enjoy the types of game, essentially linear story-driven experiences that put all the story and character and theme stuff ahead of gameplay on the priority list. That's not everyone in the industry by any means. If I can, I'd like to finish with a baseball analogy, and I hope I don't lose you all because this is not my baseball show. But there was a wild thing that happened during the Hall of Fame voting for the steroid era. The two greatest players from that era, Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, are not in the Hall of Fame because the voters decided that because they used steroids, which they definitely did, they shouldn't get in. There's a whole argument to be had there, and I'm not rehashing it now. But a player named David Ortiz, who we also know used steroids, did get in. This shows a very clear hypocrisy amongst the voting group. It does not mean that every single voter is a hypocrite, right? So there's like 200 to 300 voters that end up deciding on this stuff. And you have to get 75% of the vote. Bonds and Clemens are getting in the 65 to 70% where Ortiz just barely went over. So what that basically means is you had 20-something people who didn't vote for Clemens and Bonds, but did vote for Ortiz. So a group of 300 people ends up looking like hypocrites when it's really only 20 people who decided to exercise a principle on one occasion and not on another. And that's ultimately all that it really takes in these kinds of things to end up in a situation like this. And like I said, it's a bias, not an agenda or a deep-seated whatever. There are just people who have decided that Final Fantasy... And again, it's not that it's even an impossible expectation inside of any one individual. It's that millions of individuals all have their own expectations of what a Final Fantasy game is. And when you think about it, like, we all have the same expectation of what the next Mario game is going to be right now. The newest one just came out, and, they might throw a couple of wrenches, a couple of hammers at us, but I know what the next Mario game is going to be like. I know what the next Zelda game is going to be like. We have no idea, none, what Final Fantasy 17 is going to look like, what genre it's going to be, who's even making it, right? And that means that people's own minds and imaginations and nostalgia and expectations end up filling the gaps. And every time a new Final Fantasy comes out, it's going to fall short in some people's minds, while in other people's minds, each one, including Final Fantasy 8, 12, 13, 15, is going to end up being somebody's absolute favorite. Maybe of all time, like 16 has become for me one of my favorite video games of all time. So who cares what its Metacritic score was? The vast majority of Final Fantasy games didn't win Game of the Year. Final Fantasy Tactics, which is an absolute masterpiece, has never won an award for anything, I don't think, right? So, yeah, there was a part of me that was... I fully expected it not to get nominated. 1, it was a great year for games. 2, I had already seen how the Metacritic scores had come out. And 3, there is this thing where if there's a basic tie, Final Fantasy is going to lose every time out to the bigger legacy franchises. And to some degree, that's what makes the franchise so special. That's what sets it apart, is that it creates so many different expectations for itself. That it chooses to live in a more ambiguous space, in a more difficult space where we don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know what's around the next corner. And yeah, I would argue, like any good musician, any good artist, part of continuing to be great is continuing to risk alienating people who thought you were already great. And that's what sets Final Fantasy apart. Where Mario and Zelda are really, really good at keeping people happy and never letting people down, Final Fantasy has just accepted that every time it releases something, it's gonna let some people down. But that the gains they get in terms of their creative freedom to create things that are truly special to some of us is worth it. And I'm inclined to agree. So those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Man, I ended up talking for a long time. I thought I was going to do 10 or 15 minutes. I'm at a half an hour, so I'll go ahead and cut it off. But I do want to say, if this is your first time in, thanks for hanging out. Do consider becoming a Patreon member. It's just $1 for the subscription. It really, really helps us out. The more patrons we get, the more Final Fantasy stuff that we can do. And you get to come hang out with us in the Discord and maybe join some panel conversations in the future if that's your thing, or just vote in some polls and hang out with us and talk Final Fantasy, because it's a lot of fun. So those are my thoughts on the subject. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you will continue to be absolutely awesome out there. You know that I will continue to be absolutely Drew Creasman in here. And until next time, I will see you out there in the world.